I turned in my third and final essay on April 15th for the 9-month spiritual writing program at the Collegeville Institute. And I chose grief as a topic, as it is something that I encounter a great deal in ministry. It's not a small topic, and my very patient mentor told me after reading my first draft, "You have 5 essays in here. Pick one. Write deeply about that." So I did, about the grief and the pandemic. But this sermon is about one of the other topics in that first draft that I did not write yet. Earth grief. Earth grief is a term I came across in the works of 2 psychotherapists, Francis Weller and Chellis Glendinning. They look at the impact of climate change on our human psyches, as well as the environment. They explore the evolutionary history of us, how we were originally embedded in the matrix of life, intimately part of the interconnected web of all existence. But Western culture in particular changed that relationship, or our understanding of it, with a mechanistic understanding of the earth and all her creatures as being below human beings in a hierarchy. And that the rest of creation is there to be used and consumed by us. And this has traumatized and broken the primal connections that we have with the creation, with the earth, endangering not only the planet, but our very souls, causing us grief, the dead zones that Karen Herron describes. As Glendinning writes, the idea was that we are all part of the organism of the earth with its vast beauty as well as its gripping pain. In short, the personal is planetary and the planetary personal. When we do not acknowledge this connectedness, we become lost and paralyzed. If we were to express the wells of emotion so many of us hold about the ecological catastrophes and social injustices in our world, we would release not just tears and anger, but streams of caring and creativity. I imagine that Glendinning's words do not come to a surprise to anyone gathered here. Unitarian Universalists have been concerned about the environment and climate change and disruption for decades now. And the UUA's Green Sanctuary Ministry provides a process and resources for UU congregations to join together, become educated, active, and accredited in the work of climate justice. We did have an active Green Sanctuary group here at First Parish in the past, Diana, Rose, Tracy. And I know that many of us are involved in climate justice work in other ways in our communities. But what captured my attention about Weller's work, which goes back a decade, and Glendinning's work, which goes back at least 20 years, is their connecting climate change with the grief that impacts our mental and emotional health and spiritual health. So their point is that climate change is not just damaging to the environment around us, it's damaging to our souls. They contrast our Western thinking and culture with those of earth-centered and indigenous communities, whose ways of being and living are much more attentive and engaged with life on earth, understanding the plants and animals to be kin. Many of us read Braiding Sweetgrass during the pandemic, and Robin Wall Kimmerer, a botanist and a member of the Potawatomi Nation, talks about the honorable harvest, also known as the words before all else. I love that phrase, the words before all else. The practice among many native nations of acknowledging and giving thanks to the earth and all the natural forces and beings for sustaining us. As Kimmerer writes, as a plant, I could make the campfire, hold the nest, heal the wound, fill the brimming pot. But this generosity is beyond my realm, as I am a mere heterotroph, a feeder on the carbon transmuted by others. In order to live, I must consume. That's the way the world works. The exchange of a life for a life, the endless cycling between my body and the body of the world. So instead, I live vicariously through the photosynthesis of others. I'm not the vibrant leaves on the forest floor. I am the woman with the basket, and how I fill it is a question that matters. If we are fully awake, a moral question arises as we extinguish the other lives around us on behalf of our own. Whether we are digging wild leeks or going to the mall, how do we consume in a way that does justice to the lives that we take? One of the gifts of growing up Unitarian Universalist, as I did, is that I was not told that there was only one right interpretation of any sacred text, especially the biblical ones that tend to be at the heart of Western society's justification for many of its cultural beliefs and practices, even in the secular realm. As I read Weller and Glendinning's writings on earth grief, and as the planet suffers under the supposed dominion God granted humanity in the creation stories of Genesis, I wondered what would shift in us if we were to read the story of Adam and Eve and their banishment from the Garden of Eden through the lens of original grief rather than original sin. Would we then live with more awareness for how we are embedded in the primal matrix of all life? Would we better acknowledge both our grief and our gratitude? There are two creation stories in Genesis. The first hint that the ancient people who shared these tales didn't take them as fact, but as stories that spoke to the soul of their experiences and their questions about what it means to be human. The first story is the grand one. God, larger than all the universe, creates the entire universe, the heavens, the earth, the stars, the galaxies, with words, through the beauty of language and imagination. All of it good, from the furthest star to the tiniest grain of sand. But the second creation story is very intimate. Instead of a whole universe, God creates a garden. And desiring a companion with whom to share this lovely place, God takes a handful of Adamah, Hebrew for earth, dirt. God takes a handful of Adamah and shapes the first earthling, Adam. Adam comes from Adamah. Breathing into the nostrils and animating the Adamah with divine breath. And all life is in harmony as God walks in the garden in the cool of the evening, as it says, among all the plants and creatures that God has created, including Adam and Adam's partner, Eve. You know what happens next, right? Despite the stern warnings, Adam and Eve eat of the fruit of the tree of knowledge, and with knowledge, everything changes. They are exposed, not only physically, not only in their failure to listen, but they are exposed to the grief of being human. They now know they are mortal. They know that they and everyone they love will die, returning back to the Adamah, to the dust. They know suffering and pain and struggle and their relationships with one another and with God and the rest of creation shift dramatically as they have lost the innocence of not knowing what it means to be human. Everyone and everything we will lose. It is this knowledge that separates us from the rest of life on the planet. We are the only creatures who suffer. We are not the only creatures who suffer grief in the immediacy of death, but we are the only ones who can imagine it, who can remember it, and who have to weave it into our living for the rest of our lives. This biblical story has been used to justify a weird and destructive mix of misogyny, doctrine of original sin, and a hierarchical consumerist relationship with the rest of creation and the earth itself. So I feel like we don't pay attention to the elements in it that shift the narrative toward one that might be healing rather than destructive. Yes, the unhappy couple are expelled from the garden, and their relationships with one another and with God and with the creation are upended. But the intimacy is still there. Before sending the two human beings out into the world, God sews them garments with God's own hands to prepare and protect them for an environment different than the one that they have known. For this is a coming-of-age story as well. Adam and Eve have to leave the safety of the nest, of the home. They have to grow up and live in the world as it is. And part of becoming a mature human being is learning to live ethically, compassionately, and gratefully, even in the face of failure, unfairness, and grief. On the one hand, grief is the cacophony of emotions that come in the wake of loss. Numbness, sadness, anger, despair, denial, guilt, relief sometimes. And in the wake of a death or a significant ending, our bodies and our minds and our spirits are rocked by the impossibility of what has just happened to us. Someone we love, something we trusted in deeply is no longer there. And grief severs us from who and what we love most, who and what we trust in most. It is an expulsion from innocence. Grief is also something that once experienced we must live with for the rest of our lives. Weller calls grief an apprenticeship with sorrow, a pilgrimage of the soul that every one of us will undergo in our lifetime. And while the experiences of losses themselves are heartbreaking and traumatic in the moment, grief extends long, long past the period of mourning. Weller writes, "Grief is more than an emotion. It is a faculty of being human. It is a skill that must be developed, or we will find ourselves migrating to the margins of our lives in hopes of avoiding the inevitable entanglements with loss. It is through rites of grief that we are ripened as human beings." In other words, Weller believes that we can help one another learn over time to metabolize our grief in ways that are healing rather than destructive to our souls and to our relationships, including our relationships with the earth, by offering sacred time and space for grief to be felt and acknowledged. We can learn a lot about the rites of grief regarding our relationship with the earth and the interdependent web from indigenous and native peoples. But we also need to re-examine and heal through the stories of our own culture if we wish to shift toward healing at the foundational level. Whether we believe in them or not, they still hold sway. We need to create sacred times and spaces to express and hold our grief about the earth, so we don't get overwhelmed and despairing to the point that we become deadened inside. We can't get back to the Garden of Eden as much as the toddler in us might long for that. Nor can we continue to treat the earth as a commodity given to us as our birthright. We need to grieve the loss of innocence and naivete that the story teaches us comes with being human and being mortal. It's time for us to grow up as a species, to take responsibility for the care of the earth, as well as one another, as part of the ripening of our humanity, to metabolize our grief for the earth into rites of gratitude, hope, and creativity.